Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Incentive Compensation Management for Recurring Revenue Businesses, the 2017 Outlook. My name is Diana Bucella and I'm the Content Marketing Specialist at Obero. Our guest presenter today is David Kohari. David is the Vice President of Strategic Services and Customer Success at Canidium and is a 17-year veteran in sales performance management. David is an expert in strategy, implementation, and customer success-focused services. David hosted a series of our executive roundtables in 2016 and will be talking to you today about some of the findings from these events. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to David.
Thank you, Diana. A few housekeeping items first. Obviously, hopefully everyone is connected via audio at this point, but if you do have questions as we go through the content, please feel free to submit those questions via the chat or questions function, and we'll try to get those addressed by the end of the conversation. At the end of the conversation, we'll have some time for Q&A. And obviously, any questions that don't get answered, I'm happy to follow up via email afterwards. All right, so just quickly, a quick overview on Obero. Obero is a global company with 80+ employees. They're headquartered in Toronto in Canada, but they have offices in the US and in Europe. They also provide a fully integrated sales performance management solution that's designed specifically for sales operations and sales finance, two constituencies that we'll be talking quite a bit about here as we go through some of this material. And they are uniquely positioned to support kind of the perpetual business model, recurring revenue business model. So again, very much aligned with some of the content that we'll talk about today. And they have a dedicated team of full-time consultants to ensure, successful delivery of your solutions. I work for an organization called Canidium. Canidium is a partner of Obero. We are founded, by industry veterans with many decades of experience. As Diana mentioned earlier, we support kind of the entire life cycle of consulting from a sales performance management perspective. So we do strategic services, which happens to be the area of the business that I own, but we also deliver and implement and provide managed services around solutions such as the ones that our partner Obero provides. So we're glad to be here on this webinar today, and thanks again to Obero for also sponsoring the webinar as well as sponsoring the roundtables, which will be the main part of the content that we'll talk about today. All right, so let's get right into it. So in terms of the content today, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about sales performance management, or SPM, some definitions around that, because it's important to make sure that we're all kind of grounded in terms of what we consider to be within that that realm of SPM. Then we'll talk about recurring revenue, and we'll go through a few different perspectives on recurring revenue as well. And then we'll talk about the compensation considerations, and we'll look at that in a couple of different dimensions. One is sort of the design considerations and what recurring revenue, how recurring revenue is impacting how you structure and design your sales compensation plans. But we'll also think about it from an administrative perspective as well, right? So what are the other impacts from an admin standpoint? We'll go through a case study of a customer that we've been helping kind of with this transition, if you will, and then we'll do a product demo. So Jonathan will come on a little later and give us a demo of the product. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll spend a little bit of time doing a Q&A session there at the end. All right, so again, let's start with sales performance management, right? So if you think about it, this is our perspective, having been doing this for a while, and I will say too that this perspective has evolved over time as SPM has evolved over time. But really, ultimately, it starts with corporate goals and objectives, right? So what are you trying to achieve as an organization? And from that, you should be able to derive what your sales strategy is, right? How are we going to sell? How are we going to market? How are we going to create a sales strategy that allows us to achieve those those overall corporate goals and objectives? And then in sort of support of the execution and achievement of that strategy, there are essentially 8 primary capabilities that we tend to talk about when we talk about SPM, right? And it starts from left to right. with design. So how do I design, model, and cost my compensation plans? How do I make sure that I am identifying the behaviors within my sales organization that I want to emphasize and the outcomes that I want to reward as a function of those behaviors? The next is target. So now that I have the plans, how do I set the right goals? How do I set the right targets? How do I make sure that I have the right account assignments or territory assignments? How do I ensure that I have the organization set up to take advantage or achieve the objectives that I'm trying to establish via my compensation plan design process? And once I have those two pieces of information, then accept is really about communication, right? How do I push that information out into the sales organization so they know these are my plans, these are my objectives, this is the accounts or the territories that I have responsibility for, and I accept responsibility for that, and I understand how I'm going to be compensated or paid based on the results. In the middle is administration and reporting, right? This is the blocking and tackling. This is how do I collect the data? How do I crunch the numbers? How do I make sure the right people get credit? Ultimately, how do I put money into someone's checking account and give them good, transparent reporting that says, hey, here's all your sales activity for the previous period, and here's how you got paid on that. Inquire is what happens when the rep or the manager, whoever the payee is, looks at their bank statement or their report and they say, I don't like what's happening here, or something has gone amiss. So how do I manage that, that dispute, if you will, to resolution, and who are the different folks that need to get involved in order to do that along the way? Coaching is the constant or hopefully consistent dialogue that's taking place between managers and reps, right? So some of this is about establishing what the carrot looks like, and coaching is about helping the rep to get to the carrot, right? So there should be, hopefully some sort of ongoing coaching dialogue that's taking place between managers and reps, helping them to focus on the right behaviors to achieve those outcomes. And then finally, analyze is, this is the brass ring, right? This is what we all are talking about these days, making better data-informed decisions around our programs and how do we optimize things based on data. So now that I have data sitting in these upstream capabilities, how do I leverage that for trending, for insights, to ensure ultimately that, all of this planning that I did up front, we're actually executing against that plan or that strategy. And if I'm not, then how do I bring myself back in alignment? And if you think about it from a program perspective, programs are more than technology, right? There are organizational or people aspects, if you will. There's business process aspects, and then obviously technology as a foundation. And so today, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to focus really on the design and admin pieces of this, right? As we go through this process, we'll look at recurring revenue and what impacts it's having on how we design our plans as well as how we administer those plans. Okay, so let's jump into the recurring revenue piece of this. So the first perspective that we'll talk about is the customer perspective, and you can also think about this in many ways as the sales perspective, right? Sales being the sort of entry point into the introduction of the relationship between you and your customers. And in the old world, the old economy, this was very much a perpetual mindset, right? So I went out and I found a prospect. I talked to that prospect. I go through the sales process, and then I book the order, right? And then depending on what type of business you're in, there's usually some provisioning process where I actually have to provision the services or the product that I've sold. And then I invoice the customer, and eventually I collect my money, right? And then I'm on to the next prospect or customer after that. That's the old economy. In the new economy, it's really migrating towards this recurring revenue model, right? So if you think about not just, I know software as a service tends to be the most obvious example that we often, cling to, but it's everything today, right? You can buy razors by recurring, in sort of a subscription model. So think about anything that's a subscription-based interaction with your customers, and those are really recurring revenue streams. And this is a very different mindset, right? It's a life cycle, if you want to think about it that way, right? So once I've sort of acquired that customer, then there's other stages that I need to think about. How is the customer going to use or operate my product or solution? Will they fully adopt all of the features and functionality that I'm providing? If they do or if they don't, how are they going to realize value? Because they need to realize some value out of that. And in best case scenario, maybe even innovate, right? Now that I've used it for 3 months, 6 months, I've figured out new and interesting ways to leverage that product or service, perhaps in ways that not even the creator or provider of that service never even fully intended. And if you do all of these things, or if you help facilitate all of these things with your customer, then eventually they will renew or expand, right? Hopefully expand, at a minimum renew, so that you can maintain that sort of ongoing relationship with your customer. And so if you think about it, these are very different perspectives, right? One is sort of the acquisition, if you will, of the customer, and the other is the life cycle, right? So now that I have the customer, how do I maintain that relationship on an ongoing basis? And if you think about making better data-informed decisions, a lot of that is driven by what metrics we care about. So in this case, the conversation, if you will, has gone away from, in some ways, total contract value and attainment and margin, some of the more traditional things that we used to care about from a perpetual licensing or perpetual revenue perspective. And now it's things like annual recurring revenue or monthly recurring revenue, ARR, churn, net promoter score, and customer acquisition costs and lifetime value. This is the language, this is the the nomenclature, if you will, that we consider now that we're moving more and more into this recurring revenue cycle. And so as we went through and had our roundtables, this prompted a lot of kind of interesting discussions. If you think about it, this idea, for many of the sales and customer success executives that participated, there was this idea of transition, right? Because for a lot of organizations, they're trying to make that move from this perpetual license situation to more recurring revenue. And as you might imagine, and I'm sure some of you out there also experiencing the same thing, there can be significant cultural resistance to that change, right? You're used to this sort of mentality or model where I go out, especially in the software industry, and I sell these huge upfront licensing deals, worth millions of dollars, and then I'm on, is a classic hunter, I'm on to the next elephant, if you will. But in this new world, right, it's really, you're eating that elephant one bite at a time, and that analogy, I think, works in a couple of different dimensions. Not just that you don't get the whole elephant at once, and you can't eat the whole elephant at once. You do have to sort of consume it over time, but also from a mentality perspective, it's very different, right? The whole organization has to think about the relationship with the customer in a different way. You have to think about how you go about servicing the customer in very different ways. And there's a ton of kind of process and technology changes under the cover, as we talked about earlier, that are also required in order to accommodate that, right? And so for a lot of organizations that were participating in these conversations, this was a big topic point in terms of how you manage that. And personally, having gone through it myself, being part of a smaller kind of SaaS-based software company that got acquired by a larger software organization that was more focused on perpetual licensing or had come from that world, there was definitely a culture clash, right? And that we discussed a lot about how do you manage your way through that. And in some ways, one approach that we're seeing is just that, right? It's very difficult maybe to change from within. So a lot of these organizations are acquiring smaller players that already have that as part of their DNA, and then using that as a change agent within the broader, larger organization to help drive some of that change. The other big topic point that we talked quite a bit about was customer success, right? So this is a very hot topic right now for a lot of organizations, and really it's interesting to hear different perspectives on what is customer success, first of all, right? Is it sales? Is it services? Is it support? Is it some interesting combination of all three of those? Where should it align organizationally, right? So and I think the answer to that depends on where you think it aligns in that picture there. But one very interesting conversation that was prompted during our roundtables was who owns the customer relationship, right? So if you think back to that acquisition versus life cycle model, does the rep that acquired the business, do they maintain and own that relationship? Is it the customer success advocate or a person that's managing the ongoing relationship? So there's a lot of, and what's best from the customer's perspective too, because if you think about, from the customer, do they really want to deal with, 2 or 3 different people for their issues, or do they want to have a single point of contact that they can come to and essentially quarterback all of their issues within the organization? So a lot of what we discussed was focused around that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on as we go through the case study. All right, so that's the customer or sales perspective. We also talked about the finance perspective, right? So, and if you think about, I'll credit a website called Chaotic Flow with a lot of these charts, and I'm happy to provide some additional information. But it's a great resource for those of you that are interested in looking at kind of SaaS-based financial performance and metrics. There's some different things that, as a CFO, you care about now, right? One new rule is that churn is the thing that keeps you up at night, right? This idea that, the more customers that are leaving or not renewing our services, that has a tremendous impact on how quickly we can achieve profitability. The other thing that you think about quite a bit if you're a CFO is CAC, right? It's customer acquisition costs. And kind of the interesting thing here is that whether you're successful or whether you're having challenges in your business, in either way, you've got to drive those costs down, right? So you have to stay kind of laser focused on what your customer acquisition costs are, and in either case, kind of make sure that those are going down over time. And then finally, if you think about profitability, it really is all about upselling, right? So it's not just enough to get to renewals of sort of the existing relationship. And in many cases, we'll talk about this too, in order to acquire that business initially, a lot of organizations are providing heavy discounts just to get, the customers in the door. So it really does become about upselling and cross-selling, and that's how you accelerate the time to profitability. And so, this sort of new bottom line that we talk about a lot with customers that are looking at recurring revenue is that it's really about customer lifetime value. Ultimately, that's what's going to drive company value, and that's really what you start to care about more. There's also some interesting regulatory challenges that are about to be introduced as well. So, IFRS 15, which is effective actually a year from now, January 2018, is going to have a significant impact on revenue recognition, particularly for how you handle what are called complex contracts. And really, if you look at, the language, it's any organization that is selling recurring services or subscription services. This is probably going to affect you in one way or the other, right? And so, not only are the rules changing about how you can recognize that revenue, but it also is having, as you might imagine, a corresponding impact on accounting rules for sales comp, right? And it sort of breaks on an annual basis, right? So if your terms are less than a year, you can expense that, compensation immediately. But if the term is greater than a year, then you have to start doing some capitalization of that compensation at booking, and then you defer, any of that deferred expenses amortized over the term. There are some, exceptions in there, indirect compensation, for managers or even, product specialists that are, indirectly compensated. There's some exceptions in there, but for the most part, what this means for many organizations is that these new rules are going to inject further complexity into a problem that's already, quite honestly, as many of you probably know, fairly complex to manage, model, and report on. And so a lot of what we were talking about in our roundtables was, one, kind of who was aware of this, and two, for those that were aware, how are they planning to deal with it? And it was interesting, I think there was a spectrum, if you will, for the finance execs that were engaged at these roundtables. The spectrum on one end was some folks were completely unaware, right, that these changes were coming. Mostly, I would say, the smaller, private, pre-IPO organizations were sort of on that end of the spectrum. The larger, publicly traded companies, for folks that attended, they were aware of it. But there was definitely a spectrum on how the state of readiness, let's say, in terms of how their finance teams were ready to accommodate. of these pieces. But for those that were aware, they were taking a hard look at their infrastructure, particularly from an SPM perspective, and saying, how are we going to handle these? How are we going to handle, when something changes, the accrual process and sort of the corresponding impacts that it has. The other thing that was interesting was sort of this increasing role of finance in influencing contract terms, or the way that sales organizations were going out and marketing and selling their products, right? One CFO that participated asked this question, which prompted a lot of conversation, which was, why not just go month to month, right? So if all of this goes away, if I just have month to month contracts, why don't I do that and minimize any impact on my, on my teams, quite frankly, in my processes and technology. And so that prompted a very interesting discussion, the sort of tension point between one, should finance be dictating, contracts, and also if you think about kind of the general trend up to this point has been to push multi-year contracts, right? The idea, let's lock in that revenue stream for longer, or at least, theoretically for longer, pushing out the renewal farther out. So many of our customers have even, baked that into their incentive programs. You get paid more, you get a higher rate if you're selling a multi-year contract versus an annual contract or a month-to-month contract. So that was one, hotly debated topic, and it, I think it really hinged on stickiness. Was sort of the end result of that, right? If you have a really sticky relationship with your customer and you're confident that they're going to renew month over month, then that's great. That might be an option for you. If you're not, or if you don't, then maybe continuing to look at those multi-year arrangements and dealing with the corresponding complexity is a better way to go. So let's talk about that a little bit, right? Some of the challenges from a design and admin perspective, and we'll break it as as we talked about earlier. There's sort of this acquisition perspective, and then there's the recurring perspective. In the acquisition perspective, there's a few key questions you want to ask, right? Like, one, how long do you want sales engaged, right? So if you think about that book, provision, invoice, collect, how long does sales need to be engaged in that process? How sticky is that initial contract, right? How sticky is your initial relationship? How quickly do you need to get from booking to collection? These are some of the things that will, questions that you need to ask yourself in order to come up with the right design. And so if you think about, a lot of times these metrics include, ARR or QRR or MRR, that's annual, quarterly, and monthly, for those of you that aren't familiar with maybe some of those terms. Contract duration, as we talked about, product mix. One thing that we see a lot is, or that we recommend a lot, is pay on the lifetime value of the contract and kind of align it with the primary metric that's most likely from a renewal perspective, right? So it just makes it easier for the rep to understand, hey, if our most likely renewal model is annual, then use ARR. If it's monthly, use MRR. Another thing is to think about as you go through the design process too is discounting, right? As I mentioned earlier, and I'm sure some of you have experienced this too, controlling discounting becomes more important over time. That whole, how do I reduce customer acquisition costs? And for many organizations that are trying to, introduce customers or get customers in the door, they may be inclined to heavily discount, but understanding that and controlling it and reducing it over time becomes very critical in terms of that time to profitability. One other thing that's quite common is splitting payments, right? So if you think about some of the questions that we're asking, maybe it makes sense to split your payment over multiple milestones so that I keep sales engaged. The idea being, too, if sales remains engaged in that process, they're more likely to push it to completion faster since they want to get their money faster, right? So if I'm paying on book, the easiest example is a quarter each, right? So I pay a quarter on booking, a quarter on on provisioning, a quarter on invoicing, and a quarter on collections. And so maybe that has that drives the behavior that you want, but you got to think about the downsides as well, right? And there are downsides to doing that. One is, do you want your salespeople to be collections agents, right? Should they be out there trying to figure out how to collect money from customers that you've already provision and invoice, or do you want them out hunting new elephants? So, and there's ESAT and attrition, employee satisfaction and attrition considerations there as well. And from an admin perspective, those design decisions they have an impact as well, right? So if you think about it, common sense, the greater number of those payout events, the more data sources you might have to link to, and the more frequently you're going to have to link to those sources. And anytime you introduce more data, upstream data, you introduce the opportunity for errors, for increasing need for manual intervention in order to tie that information together if there's not unifying, sort of systemic IDs that tie all of those events together. And so quite often when we talk to customers that are thinking about these things, we say, we try to look at the data as well, the upstream data, and if it seems unreliable or, not consistent, then sometimes what we'll recommend if they still want to go in that direction is try to think about the most common scenarios that occur and then, pay based on those and maybe true up or, true up at the end of the process to make sure that, you're still aligned with essentially what got booked actually got provisioned, invoiced, and collected. Or another way to think about it is you could decouple those events from each other. So you could have a booking quota and an invoicing quota, for example, and just manage it that way as two separate buckets. So that's the acquisition. So let's think about or talk about the life cycle a bit. So again, kind of some key questions that we often pose to customers during this process are, how are you looking at churn? How are you measuring it? How are you combating churn? Again, we talked about stickiness in that initial contract on the previous slide, but how sticky is your ongoing customer relationship, right? And ultimately, how are you looking to reduce customer acquisition costs and accelerate profitability over time? So from a design perspective, a lot of times it's on retention and renewals, right? But if you think about this if you start to think about this as a life cycle, particularly in businesses where you have annual renewal cycles or even multi-year renewal cycles, you can't wait till that initial term is up to start your customer engagement, right? If your first contact after that customer has started using your product is a year later and it's to ask them to renew, you're already behind the 8 ball, right? So you have to start looking at leading indicators. You have to be engaged throughout that life cycle. So adoption and customer satisfaction become critical leading indicators that help you understand the likelihood of that renewal, as well as opportunities for additional upgrades and upsells, right? And really, that, as we talked about earlier from a finance perspective, that's the name of the game. We want to upgrade, we want to upsell, we want to accelerate profitability, but doing that also increases the stickiness of your relationship, right? So the more products and services that your customer is using, the less likely they are to churn, right? The more value, theoretically, that they're getting out of their relationship with you. And then again, we talked about this discounting situation. Freemium is a common term that we're hearing a lot now, right? So this sort of, we give it to you for free initially, and then we upsell you on these additional premium capabilities and services. So getting rid of that initial discounting, or certainly reducing it, is a huge priority, as well as, potentially, and again, depending on where you end philosophically on that spectrum, if you're pro-contract, increased multi-year contract durations, then you want to start driving that behavior as well. So these are all things to consider from a design perspective. On the admin side, it's, at the end of the day, there's a basic sort of rule that governs a lot of comp plan design, which is make sure that anything that you do is fair and measurable, right? And adoption and CSAT, while critical leading indicators, are two common places where companies fall down, right? So one, if you want to use adoption, how are you going to measure that adoption, right? How are you going to ensure that you have a fair and equitable way of measuring adoption? And there can be different dimensions to adoption as well. Adoption of, just in terms of users, adoption in terms of capabilities being used, adoption in terms of different business units. So there are tons of different dimensions to adoption. You have to think very carefully about what you're trying to measure and how you're going to measure it. And CSAT too, right? Customer satisfaction. A lot has been made about Net Promoter Score and how that's an indicator of customer satisfaction, and also kind of a leading indicator of churn or a warning sign of churn. So, if you're going to do that, make sure you have a very defensible, fair way of measuring NPS or measuring CSAT within your customer base. And as with the acquisition piece, you may want to split those payments over multiple events, right? And these are events in a life cycle instead of in a sort of a continuous line. But you're going to run into the same problems, right? The same data and linkage implications. So think very carefully as you go through that process, and maybe think about focusing your compensation plan or your compensation strategy on just a couple of those critical areas that will offer you the best bang for your buck, so to speak. And this is a bonus question that we talked quite a bit about. We'll talk a little bit about it in a second when we go through the case study. But is it the same person handling both of these phases, right? Is it the same person that does the acquisition and then manages the life cycle, or are those two different roles and responsibilities? And as you might imagine, I have my perspective, and quite interestingly, I think a lot of folks that came to the roundtables had different perspectives as well. So let's talk about that. From a design perspective, what were some of the things that we uncovered during these, or discussed during these roundtables? Well, a lot was made about this idea of hunter versus farmer, right? So is this accurate, right? This is sort of common nomenclature in our space. You have the hunters that go out and bring down the elephants, and the farmers that, account managers that sort of mine those accounts and farm those accounts for recurring business. Interesting enough, there were a lot of folks, several folks that made the perspective of, customer success is also a hunter, right? It's just hunting for additional value within an account or customer. And so for, organizations that may be sensitive to that, I'm a hunter versus a farmer, there is a case to be made, quite frankly, that, customer success or account management is also hunting. So that was a discussion point. One other big discussion point that we talked about too was this idea of paying on sales activity versus financial results, right? And I can say that historically, sort of philosophically, the idea has always been, as long as I've been doing this for the past 2 decades, you pay for the results, right? You coach and manage the activity, but you pay for the results. But there's a growing kind of discussion happening where should we be paying on activity? And if you think about, one discussion point that we talked quite a bit about was business development or inside sales teams, who are quite often, their plans are tied to activity, to, number of calls, number of opportunities, these sorts of more activity, based measures. So I think, there's a bit of a discussion or debate, honestly, happening in terms of, is it activity versus results? Is it some combination of both? And I think more and more, the idea that activity can be used as the foundation for the plans is becoming more, is more common or more prevalent, particularly as we see an increase in sort of inside sales and the use of contact centers as not just sort of servicing functions, but also as sales functions as well. And then finally, we talked a lot about rates, right? Of course, it's it's compensation plan design. So, you talk about rates. And as you might imagine, there was a range of rates thrown out there. But the general rule, I think, that came out of our discussion certainly was, you pay less for kind of the renewal revenue, the retained revenue versus the revenue acquired, right? And just to give you some rough benchmarks, I think during our discussions, most folks on the retained part were, somewhere less than 5%, right? So anywhere from 1 to 5%, let's say, with a much wider range, quite honestly, on the acquired, right? So I was hearing numbers anywhere between 5 and 15% on the upfront acquisition piece. So a big range, but generally, as you might imagine, more paid for going out and bringing down the elephant versus, I guess, consuming that elephant one bite at a time once you've brought it down. So from an admin perspective, some things that we talked about. One was who owns the administration piece, right? And I think this is changing too. Historically, it's been, we used to see a lot more HR ownership and even IT ownership to some degree, but a few years ago, we did some joint webinars with Mercer, and one of the things that they were discovering is that finance is becoming the most common owner of this function. And then sales ops is probably the fastest growing owner of the function, right? So, which makes sense if you think about most organizations have to achieve a certain level of financial profitability, if you will, and revenue before they create a wholesale sales ops organization in and of itself. In many cases, it's usually a subsection of the finance team that maybe plays that role to some degree. But certainly, finance, sales ops, they tend to be, kind of the primary places we're seeing this. And they are concerned, right? As we talked about, there's a lot of challenges around administration, whether it's upstream data integrity problems or, having the process exist today on Microsoft Office technology or dealing with split payments and accruals. A lot of these finance and sales ops execs are worried about whether or not their current infrastructure can handle even their current situation, let alone the complexity being introduced by these new regulations. And so, just very quickly, we'll talk a little bit about a telco case study that one of our customers that we were working with. They were very focused on new customer acquisition in some markets. They wanted to retain and expand in others. They are having a lot of challenges from an ESAT perspective in their sales and finance teams. Sales, we'll talk about, the finance owned the administration. And then there was a bunch of stuff coming at them, right? They knew they needed to grow. They knew that they needed to either innovate or abandon certain products based on competition. They were doing everything on Excel. They're simultaneously trying to position themselves for acquisition. And they're looking at these new regulations too and saying, how are we going to deal with this stuff? So they did a number of things, right? They kind of split their strategy based on markets. So they focused their residential part of their business on customer upsells and retention, and their kind of bigger enterprise groups on new customer acquisition. And they had a bit of both in their SMB market segment. They did end up kind of separating hunters from farmers, right? Especially in the enterprise group, as were considered very different roles with very different skill sets and focuses. And they focused kind of their Resi and SMB groups on farming, right? And tried to drive more customers towards self-service acquisition, right? Go to our website, sign up for our services, so we don't have to have reps out there trying to push those pieces. And this did a lot for them, not the least of which was improved a lot of ESAT issues that were in their sales organization, right? So trying to get people away from collection activity and doing some things they didn't want to do. But ultimately what they had to do was invest a lot in technology too, right? Just shore up a lot of their underlying systems, CRM, billing, a lot of their source systems needed help. But they also needed a new SPM solution, right? Something that would allow them to do and address some of the complex modeling and admin and reporting capabilities that they wanted to be able to support. So with that, that's a great segue actually to Jonathan. So I'm going to turn things over to him and let him provide us with a demo of the Obera product.
Thank you, David. All right, hello everybody. Okay, so today we're going to showcase some of Obero's reporting capabilities and highlight how that ties into very nicely to some recurring revenue business models. So the first asset that I'd like to show you guys today is our executive dashboard. This is a high-level dashboard that gives a nice perspective of the overall health of sales in an organization. All right, so there's a lot going on this page, but just starting up at the top left, it's pretty standard with many of our dashboards. We have our data slicers that allow us to look at specific periods in time, as well as compare different situations where we may be doing some what-if modeling or forecasting. So in the top left section here, we can see what our pipeline looks like, as well as any major opportunities that are going to be closing this month. And right underneath, we can actually see all of our critical recurring revenue stream metrics. Specifically, or most notably, we have churn here, which is the one that keeps everybody up at night. And directly underneath it, we can actually see a year-over-year comparison of what the profitability within the company looks like. On the right-hand side of our page, we have a very nice distribution geographically of all of our bookings, which we can interact with according to product or the named regions themselves. So what we might notice here at first glance is that the East Coast seems to be performing much better than the West Coast for this company. And so we may want to take a look at the New England, US. And we can see right away that Vermont is actually performing very well. And overall, this section of our geography tends to be selling a lot of CPM software as compared to SPM, ERP, or CRM. Similarly, we actually have the ability to drill down directly into the region itself, and we can see all of the sub-regions that it's comprised of and what their individual performance is. In the top right here, we've got our top performing sales reps. We can see in a tree plot here who's bringing in the most relative to the other in the top performers list. And basically, this plot will organize from top left to bottom right according to whichever metric we've chosen. In this case, it's total bookings. And last but certainly not least, we can see what our new annual contract value is for the year and what our annual recurring revenue growth is, as well as any new customers we've taken on, and what our attainment is relative to our booking goals. All right, next we have our cost of sales dashboard. This is very much related to the recurring revenue businesses. Just to give you perspective here, whenever you see purple on the dashboard, that is an indication of something being expensive relative to something else. So much like our other dashboard on the left here, we have our data slicers that allow us to filter according to segment, region, scenario, and time. In this first section of our dashboard, we have our customer acquisition cost, which is important to minimize over time. We can see what our actual profit margin is and what our monthly average revenue per account is. Underneath the measurement of our average cost ratio, which is essentially the fraction of the cost of a sale relative to the amount of revenue that it generates, we've got our customer acquisition cost recovery time, which is meant to be minimized at best, and the lifetime value of our customers, as well as what the ratio of a given customer's lifetime value is to the cost of their acquisition. Finally, to the right of this, we can see what products are most expensive for the business to sell, the purple being the most expensive and the blue being the least expensive. And we can actually compare that nicely relative to the total volume of that product that we're actually selling. Underneath this section, we can actually take a look at our contribution and the costs associated with that. So we can see across the 4 main regions of our company that the customer acquisition costs are relatively the same, although the actual contributions to the total bookings is somewhat different from region to region. If we notice that perhaps the Eastern US was bringing in a lot of bookings, but their average cost ratio was much higher, then there may be something additional to read into there. Our YTD sales gauge, that's just a general overview. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but what is interesting is directly above this, we have another map which shows how expensive our individual states are in terms of generating sales. So as we might expect, we can see down here that Vermont is nice and blue because they contribute a large amount of sales and their cost ratio is relatively low compared to the amount of bookings that they're generating. Whereas over in North Dakota, we can actually see they have a much higher cost ratio while providing a very small fraction of total bookings for the company. And finally, as we get to the right side of the page here, we have 2 very different looking comparisons. The first being our sales performance by product, and this is where we can actually see what the profit is that's generated by a product compared to its cost of sale. So ideally we would like to see our products be around the top left of this plot as opposed to the bottom right, which would indicate that perhaps some changes need to be made in how those sales are approached. And underneath it we have another tree map showing the bookings generated by each account, and the hue that we see here, you can see a little bit of purple in this guy down here, that actually shows a scale of how expensive that client was to acquire. So let's just take a step back here for a second. I'm going to dive into our small and medium business segment, where you can see right away our measurements have all changed, so we can actually look on a segment by segment basis to see what the performance of that segment is. And now we are actually just seeing our small and medium business customers. We can pick up very easily, perhaps Lone Star Systems here, although they may have brought in a good amount of money, they were actually very expensive to implement. And this can be an indicator that some digging needs to happen as to just why they were so expensive, whether a rep was giving out undesired levels of discounts, or there were was a lot of traveling involved, whatever that may be. And finally, I'd just like to add, we can see that actually our costs of selling certain products within the company are actually dependent on the segment itself. I would like to just jump back again to enterprise. We can see that the sales performance management software is a relatively expensive piece to sell to the small and medium business segment, but in the enterprise, we can actually see that it is a slightly better performing product in the enterprise segment. So again, we can draw very quickly some insights that can better guide your company and how they assess the cost of sales. And just lastly, before moving on to the next dashboard, we can also give you the power to look at things on a region by region basis and highlight and basically drill into the data very quickly without having to do a lot of work switching between spreadsheets, whatever it is that you're normally left to do to figure out who's performing better than who and why. Okay. So our third dashboard here it's our contracts dashboard. We have similar data slicers here, and there are two key plots here that I would just like. We can see our MTD reporting plot, which shows a comparison of our bookings and recognized revenue as it compares to our compensation costs and compensation expenses on a monthly basis. So, of course, we want to see our compensation costs and compensation expenses be as low as possible compared to the bookings and revenue that are being generated. If we have a situation where our costs and expenses are exceeding our bookings and revenue, then we've definitely got a problem. And lastly, but certainly not least, our YTD bookings and collections, to give an at-a-glance overview to see how our collections are trending compared to the bookings that are coming in. So we would like to see our collections be as close as possible to our bookings on a regular basis. So this is essentially some of the high-level reports that best address some issues for recurring revenue businesses. But I'd like to now just switch gears for a second and take a look at our compensation dashboard, which is a sales representative level report. And this is something that your reps would be able to see on a regular basis when they log into the system. So just to give you an idea, of course, at the top left here, we can show what their attainment is relative to their quota for the year. We can see they can see directly how their crediting is ramping up compared to what their quota is. They'll be able to take a look at exactly what their month-to-date credit is, as well as year-to-date credit. And similarly, they can see what their earnings are relative to the amounts that have actually been released to them through your finance department. They can, of course, during the year have a very good idea of how much money they have left to make to give them some motivation to close some remaining deals. They can tell exactly how much quota they need to achieve that. And finally, on the right-hand side, we can give our representatives an idea of where they stand relative to other members on their team. So they can see for year to date, month to date, and then again with the tree plot, they can see just how much credit they are bringing into the company relative to the other employees. So they know if they're not near the top of this plot, then something needs to change. Finally, this is a very high-level dashboard, and what we like to do is we have a philosophy of removing guesswork for sales employees so that they're not doing shadow accounting in their spare time to make sure that everything's on track. So we've actually give them the capability to jump right into their compensation statement. So I think I just want to make sure we're going to 2016. We're going to go 2016 month 4 and load this for Charles Paris. So right away we can see the payee details, a listing of all the metrics that they have as well as their effective dates. And below that, the good stuff, which is the quota, attainment, credit, and earnings that they have for each metric. In this case, we just have bookings here, and so they can see they're probably more accustomed to seeing what exactly this looks like. Now, just to clarify, this isn't an actual Excel report. We leverage Excel's front-end logic, but all of the actual brains of our software happens behind the scenes, and it's just a reporting tool we use to make things feel a little bit more familiar and comfortable. So just one last report to drill into here. If a rep seems to think that there's any inconsistencies or they're just curious about the earnings on a particular metric, they can drill directly into the transactions that are underlying for that metric. You'll see here that the date is retained in the form, so we know we're going to exactly the month we want to see. We can see on a transaction by transaction basis exactly what was entailed in the sale, when it happened, how much it was for, and on the far side we can actually see whether it was qualified, what metric it falls under, what credit we were given, as well as the rates that led to the payment that was generated. And just underneath that, we can actually see a list of any transactions that were specifically not qualified. So they will know if something's there, it should be there, and if it's not, it will still be listed, and they will be able to see exactly why it wasn't qualified for payment. Okay, so that's about it for me. I'm going to hand things back over to David now, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, David and Jonathan. I'd just like to mention that if you are looking for best practices for incentive compensation or you would like a more in-depth demo, please visit www.oberospm.com. So now we're going to open up the floor to any questions. If you have a question for either David or Jonathan, please feel free to ask it in the question window of the webinar. So we do have a couple questions in here. The first question that we had was about whether or not we will be receiving the deck from today's presentation, and you will be receiving an email with all the material, including a recording of the presentation. And the next question is for David. So David, where do you most often see customer success being aligned organizationally, and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I can tell you this. I have my own sort of perspective on that, having built the customer success organization. But it's interesting, customer success, I would say, we've seen just a proliferation of that term over the past, let's call it 4 or 5 years. More often than not, quite honestly, it's a support function. So a lot of times, when I go in and talk to organizations, I ask, do you guys have a customer success program? They're like, yeah, it's part of our tech support, or it's part of our ongoing support team. So it's interesting that it's that it started there, but I've seen it everywhere, right? I've seen it there, I've seen it in sales, I've seen it in services. I've actually seen organizations where they take everything post-sale and they convert it to one huge customer success organization. My own sort of philosophical, I guess, preference is that it's not a support function, right? It's an ongoing success function, and so it is a blend in many ways of a bit of sales, but a lot of services, right? My take on customer success is ultimately it's about providing value or ensuring value realization within your customer base. And so in order to do that effectively, you've got to be more than just a person that picks up the phone and asks for the customer's money at the end of the renewal cycle. You need to be providing constant value to that customer throughout your relationship. And the only way you can do that is by taking kind of a consultative approach to how you manage that relationship. So my sense is that in many organizations, as it continues to evolve, it will be kind of a balance, quite frankly, between sales and services.
Thank you. So the next question is for Jonathan, and the question is, where do you get the data from, and can Obero SPM integrate with an ERP?
Yes. Okay. So one of the fundamental pieces of our philosophy at Obero is we have a very open data model. So the companies we work most closely with is Scribe, and they have a connector for just about everything. But we have not come across a situation yet where there was a data system that we were not able to integrate with without issue.
Thank you, Jonathan. So if there aren't any other questions right now, I'm going to pass the mic back to David for closing remarks.
Okay. Yeah, just very quickly, I know we're a little bit over time here, but I think the three things for me are, this recurring revenue model is here to stay, right? It's the way that we, even as consumers, we want to interact with our service providers, right? But it does introduce a lot of complexity, not just from a comp perspective, but as we talked about, there are increasing regulatory challenges that you'll have to deal with. And you also have to understand and appreciate that there's a difference between what happens during customer acquisition versus what happens during that life cycle. And really understanding that difference is the beginning of addressing the complexities involved. And just know too that it's a journey, right? We talk to a lot of organizations, and it's not something that that happens overnight. So you're going to evolve your sales organization, you're going to evolve your sales support model, and all of the things that contribute to sales performance management will need to evolve along with that. So your North Star should really be just make sure that you're thinking about what the right behaviors are and setting up the right roles to address and emphasize those right behaviors. And as Diana pointed out, I wanted to thank you for your time today. You'll be getting our contact information as well as some of the material that we shared with you. So thanks for joining us, and I look forward to hearing from you if you have any additional questions.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.